Hello everyone, welcome to the Orchid Hut. My name is Dana, and today's video is going to be about the array of different orchid media that you see in front of the camera. This was a video request made by Gloria, so I hope Gloria will find this video and give it a watch, and I hope, Gloria, that it helps you make choices about your media. And I hope that you get the information out of it that you're looking for. Okay, so before we start going through all of the different media examples, I'm going to insert a little picture of today's weather in my area. Now, part of the reason that I'm doing this, and I think I may do this at the beginning of every week, is to kind of let you know what I am experiencing with my weather and my climate. And it will probably maybe better help you understand why I make some of the choices that I make with my orchids. I do live in a subtropical climate, so everything I'm going to share with you is somewhat skewed by those environmental conditions. Before I even get started on all of these media examples today, if what you are currently using works for you, like we say in the South, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, you know, this is just meant to kind of not so much tell you what media to use, but rather what are the characteristics of the different types of orchid media that you could choose from, and then you have to make the best choice coupled with your weather, climate, environment. Okay, so that aside, let's look at the little weather picture for me today. You'll notice that we started off the morning in the, kind of mid to low 70s. Now that's Fahrenheit. I think that converts to like about 24 degrees Celsius. And it was supposed to be a partly cloudy, partly sunny kind of day on Monday, but we did have a good bit of heavy fog this morning. Now, it wasn't at ground level, it was a little bit higher up, but it did block the morning sun until about 10 o'clock or so. So my orchids didn't typically get the morning dappled sun like they're used to getting. October is still the tail end of the growing season for my area. Because you can see, look, today's high, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that converts to like about 34 degrees Celsius. So still very, very warm here. The humidity, 96%. It doesn't get much more humid than that. And then if you look at the weather for the rest of the week, tomorrow is similar to today, but then on Wednesday it starts to rain. And when it rains here, it can oftentimes be like a monsoon. It's not just a light shower, but it rains a lot, and it can rain for several hours. And because of the humidity, things don't dry out quickly. But on Wednesday, you'll notice that the night temperatures are going to drop down to 60, because there is a bit of a cold front moving through. And then it warms up fine enough during the day on Thursday and Friday, bright sunny days. But at night, look at the temperatures, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, starting to get a little bit cool for orchids to be outside. And then 55, yeah, really getting close to being too cool for many orchids to be outside. So when nighttime temperatures drop like this, I try to prepare several days in advance by letting them dry out. So after yesterday's rain, and after Saturday's rain, I began moving the orchids into the garage, because if it rained again, then they were going to be too wet for the cold nights that are coming up later in the week. So I always have to think ahead with my orchids and give them a chance to dry out before the nighttime temperatures get too cool. Now in my garage, I can maintain about 10 degrees warmer than what the outside temperature is like. So having the orchids in the garage when the weather gets into the 50s is perfectly okay. This will only be like this for 2 or 3 nights, and then we will go back to weather like today, which is 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and mid to low 70s at night. Okay, so with all of that explanation about weather and climate, part 2 of this, we're going to get into each one of these different types of media for orchids, and we'll talk about their properties and how they might help your orchids grow better. Okay, so this is going to be a look at the first 3 different types of media that I have either used in the past or will begin using again sometime in the future. Full disclosure here, the orchid mixes that I use are all pre-made, and they are supplied by repotme.com. They have not paid me to advertise for them. However, when I started with orchids, 6 or 7 years ago, I attempted to sort of make my own mixes, and I pretty much had no clue what I was doing, and those mixes were not successful. So once I discovered the pre-made mixes, my orchid growing improved tremendously. It saved me a ton of time because I could just pour what I needed out of the bag and most times just use it as is. Now, at the end of this video, I will kind of go into how I might change up the mix a little bit depending on the circumstances or the orchid. But for the most part, I use the pre-made mixes straight out of the bag, no changes. Okay, so we are going to start with the mixes for the Phalaenopsis type orchids first that I use, and then very similar to that is the Cattleya mix. So we're going to do those 3 first. Now, I'm also going to be using terms like large media, medium bark chunks, small bark chunks, chunky bark chunks, and all of those terms, small, medium, large, are very, very subjective. What might be large bark to someone might just be medium bark to someone else. So for the purposes of kind of leveling the playing field here, I am going to refer to the Phalaenopsis type bark as large, okay? And the only thing larger than this that I use is actually the chunky bark, which I will show you at the very end. Okay, so this is the primary mix right here that I use for most of my Phalaenopsis orchids. It consists of what I refer to as large pine bark. It has some pieces of sponge rock in it. It has, now this is hydroton. I think the registered name is leca, but it's basically kind of a puffed up clay ball. So it's very, very lightweight, and the inside of it is porous, so it does hold moisture. So it has some of that in it. It has the odd strand of sphagnum moss, or some people refer to it as zombie moss. And let's see what else. I think that's it. So this is the primary mix that I use for my Phalaenopsis type orchids. It is larger bark chunks simply because the roots of the Phalaenopsis are large enough to be able to work with this bark, okay? It provides enough airspace in between the pieces, and it holds moisture in my environment really well for the Phalaenopsis type orchids. Now, another Phalaenopsis type bark that holds moisture just a tiny bit more than this first one is the bark that is made from coconut husks. And the reason that this holds moisture a bit more is because of the fibrous nature of the coconut husk. So if you have an environment that maybe is a bit drier than mine, or maybe you don't get around to watering your orchids maybe quite as often as you need to, this bark could maybe help you out because it will retain the moisture a bit better than this first one. Okay, so this mix also has some rock in it, which is called staleite. So the staleite is volcanic rock that is porous. So that's in here. There's the tiniest bit of sponge rock. And that looks like about it. Okay, so this is another option for Phalaenopsis type orchids if you feel like you need a bit more moisture. Okay, now very, very related to this first Phalaenopsis type bark is what I use for Cattleya type orchids. And I used the last little bit of mine when I was repotting some of my smaller Cattleya orchids. It's very similar to this, with the exception of the sponge rock is a bit bigger. It has larger pieces of the hydroton, and the Cattleya bark also has some of the volcanic rock in it, the staleite. Okay, so those are the first three. We will be moving on now to part 2, which talks about some of the smaller orchid bark and how that helps the orchids that get planted in them. The next bark that I want to show you is what I use for my dendrobium orchids. Now, if you think about it, most dendrobiums have a more fine root system as compared to the Phalaenopsis. So now the bark is being downsized from large pieces to medium pieces, okay? And it is the same pine bark that was in the Phalaenopsis bark, but the dendrobium bark now has kind of like a red lava rock in it that's very porous, and it has some smaller pieces of the sponge rock, and that's about it. Okay, so this, there's less air space in between these smaller bark pieces, but dendrobium roots, because they are a bit smaller, prefer a slightly smaller bark. Okay, moving on to the next one. This is what I use for my oncidiums. This is what I call a small bark chip. So again, it's the pine bark, but it has mixed in like some tiny, tiny little pieces of cork. It has much smaller pieces of the red rock in it. And if you think about oncidium roots, they're a finer root again, so we're kind of going down in size for our root systems. And this is what I prefer over growing my oncidiums in sphagnum moss, unless of course they're mounted. So this is my choice for oncidiums. Now, paphs, slipper orchids, and phragmipediums, the bark is very similar to this size, because the root system of paphs and phragmipediums are finer. But if you get the bark specifically made for this, it will have some smaller pieces of the hydroton in it as well. But it is very similar to this. Okay, coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit about seedlings, and then we will move on to the media additives that I use. Okay, so there is a bark mix that you can get that is very small, and it is specifically made for seedlings. The only time that I have used the bark pieces that are this tiny is when I have something like keikis that are true seedlings. So these keikis now are about a year old, and I had harvested them from some spikes that I had. And you can see I used the very small seedling mix inside this net pot, and then I amended with some sphagnum moss on the top so that the moisture could be maintained. And so that brings me to some of the other additives that I will often use. First is the sphagnum moss. So if I feel like the orchid needs a bit more moisture than what one of the pre-made mixes will provide, I will add some plain sphagnum moss like I did in the case of these seedlings. And then you've seen me use the large chunks of pine bark in the bottom of my pots so that the drainage holes don't get clogged by the dust found in the other media. So I will either put this in the bottom of the pot, or I will put the large cork pieces. Now the other thing that I do if I have the wooden slat baskets, I will oftentimes put a layer of the moss in the bottom, and then some of these other chunkier pieces won't fall through the slats in the basket. So oftentimes I will kind of combine these three in the wooden slat baskets mixed in maybe with some other media. And then last but not least are the charcoal pieces. Now some people would say that the charcoal has antibacterial properties. I don't know that to be true, but I will add this from time to time because the pieces are large. It will provide some more aeration between some of the bark media, and you know, I will add that on a whim. I can't really say that I always do it, but I sometimes do. Okay, so that wraps up all of the different medias that I use for different types of orchids. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments below, or if you have experiences with different types of media that you would like to share, please feel free to post that in the comments as well. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it or learned something new, and the subscribe button will be in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Thanks so much for watching, and talk to you next time. One final note about orchid media. Please do not fall victim to banana peels, coffee grinds, eggshells, or anything like that. Really,